At 9:17 in the morning on December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, more than 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft disappear into the southern sky toward Pearl Harbor. The engines faded into the distance. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. The plan was already in motion. Genda was not simply another officer aboard the carrier. He was the principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. For 11 months, he had lived inside this operation. He refined every detail. He calculated every variable. He planned for contingencies that might never occur, and for failures that could not be allowed to happen. He knew the American fleet order of battle down to individual destroyers. He knew how many aircraft were stationed on Oahu. He knew the harbor's depth, the anchorage patterns, the air defense layout. He studied reconnaissance photographs so thoroughly that he could draw Pearl Harbor from memory, pier by pier, hangar by hangar. By every conventional measure, the attack was the product of meticulous intelligence work. And yet, there was one number that Genda and the entire Japanese naval intelligence system had catastrophically wrong. One figure, a single miscalculation that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War before a single bomb was dropped. Japanese High Command estimates projected that by December 1943, the United States Navy would consist of 13,070 officers, 296,000 enlisted personnel. Those figures shaped every Japanese war plan. They determined how long Japan believed it could fight, how many ships America could crew, how many losses the enemy could absorb before seeking peace. The reality was something else entirely. By December 1943, the actual strength of the United States Navy stood at 219,279 officers, 212,472 officer candidates, and over 2.34 million enlisted personnel. Japan had miscalculated American naval manpower by more than 7-1. This was not a clerical error, not a misplaced decimal, not a failure of collection. It was a failure of understanding. And by the time Japanese intelligence grasped the truth, the machinery of American mobilization was already unstoppable. The first man to sense that something was wrong was Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa. Yoshikawa was not a conventional intelligence officer. He had once been a promising naval aviator, but a chronic stomach illness ended his flying career in 1936. Unable to fly, he was reassigned to naval intelligence. It proved to be an inspired decision. Yoshikawa possessed a sharp analytical mind and an extraordinary memory. He could absorb complex visual information and recall it with precision. These skills made him invaluable. On March 27, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Yoshikawa arrived in Honolulu under diplomatic cover, using the alias Tadashi Morimura. His assignment was simple in wording, but vast in scope. Observe American naval activity, report fleet movements, assess base infrastructure and defensive readiness. Yoshikawa was meticulous. He took public tour boats through Pearl Harbor, appearing no different than any other visitor. He rented small civilian aircraft to photograph installations from the air. He posed as a tourist, memorizing patrol schedules and security routines. He counted ships. He counted aircraft. He noted where vessels anchored and how often they moved. His reports were detailed. They were accurate. The problem was not what Yoshikawa observed. The problem was how Tokyo interpreted it. Yoshikawa reported battleships, carriers, cruisers. Tokyo headquarters counted those ships and then calculated the crews required to operate them using Japanese manning standards. This was the fatal assumption. Japanese warships operated with lean crews built around efficiency and elite professionalism. Every sailor was expected to perform multiple functions. Redundancy was minimal. Japanese intelligence assumed the Americans followed the same philosophy. They did not. Ironically, Japanese intelligence possessed abundant information about American naval practices. Naval attachés in Washington submitted regular reports. Technical journals documented American shipbuilding programs. Captured documents were analyzed. Merchant sailors were interviewed after visiting U.S. ports. The data existed, but data is not understanding. The Japanese intelligence system suffered from deep institutional weaknesses. Intelligence was considered a secondary function, less prestigious than operations or command. Few officers were assigned to it. Fewer still rose through its ranks. Ambitious officers avoided intelligence billets because they offered little recognition and limited advancement. When intelligence assessments conflicted with operational plans already in development, they were often ignored. The cultural bias toward decisive offense made caution sound like weakness. One officer who relied heavily on these flawed intelligence estimates was Captain Toshikazu Oka, serving in the operations section of the Naval General Staff. Oka was no fool. He had spent years studying American naval doctrine, logistics, and industrial capacity. In the months before the war, he and his colleagues performed careful calculations. They examined American shipbuilding schedules, training pipelines, personnel development systems, logistics and supply infrastructure. Using manpower projections that assumed America would expand its navy as Japan had, they concluded the United States could sustain roughly 40 major combatants in the Pacific. This estimate was accepted at the highest levels, and it shaped everything. Japan's grand strategy depended on it. Seize Southeast Asia's resources, establish a vast defensive perimeter, inflict early losses, force negotiations before American strength fully materialized. The Japanese believed they were fighting a numerically limited opponent, one that would eventually compromise rather than endure a prolonged war. They were preparing for the wrong conflict. Why did so many intelligent, experienced officers make the same mistake? The answer lies in a concept intelligence professionals call mirror imaging. Mirror imaging is the assumption that the enemy thinks like you do, operates like you do, and values the same things you do. Japanese planners viewed America through a Japanese lens. The Imperial Japanese Navy emphasized elite crews, long training cycles, and professional sailors developed over years. Reservists played little role. Mass recruiting was viewed with skepticism. Japanese peacetime navy of roughly 120,000 men expanded to just 300,000 by the end of the war, a threefold increase considered extraordinary for Japanese standards. They assumed America would expand the same way. They could not imagine a different model. The reality was beyond anything Japanese intelligence could conceptualize. In June 1941, the U.S. Navy had approximately 284,000 personnel worldwide. 18 months later, by December 1942, that number had surged to 1.64 million. By December 1943, it reached 2.37 million. This growth was not linear, it was exponential. Training facilities multiplied, recruitment accelerated. Industry, education, and society reoriented entirely toward war. Japanese intelligence knew America could build ships faster. What they failed to grasp until it was too late was that America could also build the people to crew them at a scale no navy in history had ever achieved. American shipbuilding statistics were not secret. They were published openly in trade journals, engineering magazines, and technical publications that Japanese intelligence officers read regularly. The Japanese knew how many ships the United States was building. They knew where those ships were being constructed. They knew how quickly hulls were sliding down the ways. What they did not understand was something far more decisive. America could recruit, train, and deploy the people to operate those ships at the same time, at a pace no other nation in history had ever achieved. The United States was not constrained by manpower. In 1941, America's population stood at 131 million people. Of those, roughly 50 million were men of military age, even after accounting for agricultural deferments needed to keep food production stable, essential industry exemptions required to keep factories running, and physical disqualifications for health reasons. The pool of potential recruits was not merely large, it was effectively inexhaustible. Japan's Imperial Navy, by contrast, drew from a population of 73 million, burdened by rigid social and institutional constraints. Women were excluded from naval service except for a handful of administrative roles. Social class distinctions restricted advancement and recruitment. Educational requirements were strict and inflexible. The mathematics should have been obvious. A nation with twice the population and far fewer barriers to service could mobilize vastly more personnel. But intelligence analysis is not about what should be obvious. It is about what analysts are prepared to accept. And Japanese intelligence officers were not prepared to imagine an enemy capable of expanding its navy tenfold in less than 4 years. The first indication that something was wrong came in May 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported an American task force centered on 2 aircraft carriers. Under Japanese doctrine, a fleet carrier required approximately 2,000 personnel, including its embarked air group. 2 carriers meant roughly 4,000 sailors in the operational area. That number fit neatly within Japanese expectations. But radio intercept specialists monitoring American communications heard something disturbing. Multiple task group commanders, extensive logistics coordination, screening forces far larger than expected for a 2-carrier formation. Post-battle analysis estimated 7,000 to 9,000 American personnel operating in support of just 2 carriers, nearly double what Japanese planners believed was possible. The intelligence was recorded and then rationalized away. Perhaps American commanders were inefficient. Perhaps they were overstaffed due to inexperience. Perhaps this was an anomaly. The warning sign was ignored. The second indication came 1 month later, in June 1942, at Midway. The battle was a catastrophe for Japan. 4 fleet carriers lost, more than 3,000 highly trained personnel killed, pilots, deck crews, and maintenance specialists who could never be replaced. But the shock that followed did not come from the defeat itself. Battles are won and lost. What stunned Japanese intelligence officers was American damage control. The USS Yorktown absorbed multiple bomb hits and torpedo strikes. Under Japanese assumptions, she should have sunk quickly. Instead, she refused to die. Yorktown was struck by 3 bombs shortly after noon on June 4. By 2:40 p.m., she was dead in the water, fires raging, flight deck torn open, power systems offline. By every Japanese measure, the ship was finished. Yet within 2 hours, American damage control teams had restored electrical power, patched flight deck holes with steel plates, contained fires, and brought the ship from 0 speed to 20 knots. By 4 p.m., Yorktown resumed flight operations, launching and recovering aircraft as if the earlier damage had been superficial. Japanese damage control doctrine relied on small, elite specialist teams, trained to perfection but operating with minimal redundancy. The Americans appeared to have dozens of damage control personnel, with backup teams ready to replace casualties instantly. Japanese analysts asked a simple question: where did all those people come from? A Japanese fleet carrier typically operated with about 1,500 crew. Intelligence estimates assumed American carriers were similar. They were not. Documents recovered floating in the water after Midway, crew lists, and administrative paperwork revealed that Yorktown carried over 2,200 personnel, nearly 50% more than Japanese planners had assumed. That meant 50% more damage control capability, 50% more maintenance capacity, 50% more sustained combat power. The implications were staggering, and still, Tokyo did not revise its core assumptions. The third warning arrived in August 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign, America's first major offensive of the war. Japanese intelligence expected a limited landing, perhaps 2 or 3 reinforced battalions, 8,000 to 10,000 troops at most. Instead, 11,000 U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal alone, with additional forces seizing Tulagi and nearby islands. Total American ground forces committed exceeded 16,000 men. Naval support was even more alarming. 3 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 14 cruisers, 31 destroyers. The personnel required to operate and support that force exceeded 30,000 sailors, not counting merchant marine crews manning transport vessels. Supplies flowed continuously. Merchant ships, crewed by civilian sailors, trained in months, not years, delivered ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements at a pace Japanese submarines struggled to disrupt. Japanese patrols reported convoy traffic levels that seemed impossible for a navy Tokyo believed had fewer than 400,000 total personnel. At the same time, the United States was maintaining Atlantic convoy operations against German U-boats, training new naval units for future deployment, crewing hundreds of ships still under construction. The numbers did not add up. Either Japanese intelligence estimates were fundamentally wrong, or the Americans had discovered a way to multiply manpower beyond any rational calculation. Tokyo chose the explanation that preserved existing assumptions. They believed the Americans were overextended. They waited for a breaking point. It never came. By early 1943, field commanders sent increasingly urgent reports to Tokyo. Then came a message that could not be ignored. Admiral Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, personally sent a cable to the Naval General Staff. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industry and organization better than most Japanese officers. His message was blunt. American naval strength in the Pacific had reached levels incompatible with all pre-war intelligence projections. Either the Americans had stripped the Atlantic bare, or Japanese planning assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Tokyo now had to confront a truth it had spent 2 years avoiding. The war they had planned no longer matched the war they were fighting. The request was assigned to a small group of officers within the Naval Intelligence Division who specialized exclusively in American naval analysis. These were not junior analysts. They were career intelligence officers, men who had spent years studying U.S. fleet organization, doctrine, and industrial capacity. If anyone in Tokyo could answer Admiral Yamamoto's question, it was them. They began by pulling every intelligence report from the previous 18 months. Nothing was excluded. They reconstructed American naval strength from the ground up, using observed reality rather than theoretical estimates. Submarine patrol reports detailing ship sightings across the Pacific, aerial reconnaissance photographs identifying hull types and task group composition, radio intercepts revealing call signs, command structures, and unit designations, prisoner interrogations providing direct testimony about crew sizes and onboard organization. Every ship sighted was logged. Every task force was mapped. They started in the Pacific Theater, counting every American vessel reported by Japanese submarines, aircraft, and surface forces. Then they calculated minimum crew requirements based on vessel type and mission profile. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries, and logistics ships. No optimistic assumptions, no worst-case exaggerations, just conservative numbers. Then they expanded the analysis outward. They added Atlantic operations visible through intelligence collection, convoy escorts operating between the United States and Britain, carrier groups supporting amphibious operations in North Africa, naval forces covering the Mediterranean, training commands operating on both the American east and west coasts, shore stations conducting maintenance, repair, logistics, and command functions. Each category added thousands, then tens of thousands more personnel. The preliminary total shocked even the analysts conducting the study. Over 850,000 naval personnel actively engaged in operational roles. That number alone was already more than double the estimates used in Japanese pre-war planning. But the analysis was not finished. When American manning standards, documented in captured operational manuals, were applied to the observed ship counts, the total increased again. Carriers carried more crew than expected. Destroyers were manned far above Japanese norms. Logistics vessels carried full repair and damage control teams. The revised figure climbed to 1.2 million personnel. And that was only active forces. The number did not include recruits in basic training, sailors in technical schools, advanced training units preparing for deployment, officer candidate programs, shore-based administrative and logistical establishments, all of which were essential to sustaining continuous global operations. The intelligence officers concluded that Japanese estimates of American naval manpower were low by at least 3 to 1, possibly 4 to 1 or more. The reports were submitted to senior leadership in spring 1943. They were read carefully. They were questioned aggressively, and they were debated endlessly. For many senior officers, the conclusions felt impossible. They had spent their entire careers in a navy that expanded slowly and deliberately, one ship commissioned at a time, one sailor trained over years of apprenticeship. The belief that mobilization had natural limits was deeply ingrained. Training took time. Competence required experience. Unit cohesion demanded prolonged service together. The idea that America could train hundreds of thousands of sailors in months rather than years seemed fundamentally flawed. Such a force, they reasoned, must be inefficient.
poorly trained, low in quality, fragile under combat conditions. The question they kept asking revealed the depth of the misunderstanding. How could such a force possibly fight effectively? In July 1943, the debate changed. A captured American sailor provided confirmation that could not be easily ignored. The sailor was a radio operator from a destroyer sunk off Kolombangara during a night surface engagement. He was young, recently trained, and unusually forthcoming. Japanese interrogators often noted that American prisoners were more willing to talk than Japanese personnel would have been under similar circumstances. The cultural differences extended even into captivity. The sailor described his training experience at Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois. He said he had trained with 4,000 recruits in his company alone. He described the facility as processing 20,000 new sailors each month through an 8-week basic training program. The interrogation officer stopped him, asked him to repeat the number. There must have been a translation error. There was not. 20,000 per month meant 240,000 sailors per year from a single training facility. And this was only basic training. It did not include officer candidate schools commissioning ensigns and junior grade lieutenants. It did not include technical schools training radio men, gunner's mates, machinist mates, and electricians. It did not include advanced training units for flight crews, submarine crews, and specialized warfare units. The sailor mentioned, almost casually, that he had friends training at 3 other major facilities around the country with similar capacity. If that was true, the United States was adding close to 1 million new sailors per year. The interrogation report reached Tokyo in August 1943. It was read, filed, and once again questioned. The prisoner might be exaggerating. He might be confused. He might misunderstand how the system actually worked. Prisoners say many things. The information was marked as potentially significant, but not independently verified. The resistance to accepting uncomfortable truths remained strong. Then came confirmation from a source that could not be dismissed. In September 1943, a German submarine operating in the Atlantic transmitted a detailed patrol report to Berlin. It described convoy escort operations observed over several days. The report included technical observations about American destroyer escorts, their tactics, crew organization, and manning levels. As part of routine Axis intelligence exchange, the report was shared with Japanese naval intelligence through the military attaché in Berlin. The German submarine commander had observed American escorts at close range during action stations. He counted personnel visible on deck. His estimate? 180 to 200 crew members. Comparable Japanese destroyer escorts operated with 110 to 120. The American ships were not significantly larger. They were simply more heavily manned. The Germans noted this as an operational curiosity. For Japanese analysts, it was something else entirely. It confirmed a pattern they had resisted acknowledging. If American escorts carried 50% more crew, then carriers likely did as well. Battleships, cruisers, auxiliaries, every ship type. September 1943 marked the moment Tokyo quietly acknowledged a fundamental error. A special working group was formed inside the Naval Intelligence Division. Its mission was explicit: reassess American personnel strength without regard to existing assumptions. No comfort, no cultural bias, no theoretical limits. Only observed reality. For the first time since the war began, Japanese intelligence was forced to confront a truth that would shape the remainder of the conflict. They were not fighting an enemy that would eventually run out of men. They were fighting an enemy whose greatest weapon was organizational scale.
The working group was given access to classified files from every relevant branch of the Imperial Japanese Navy: operational intelligence, signals intelligence, diplomatic reporting, prisoner interrogation summaries, industrial and training assessments. They were explicitly instructed to discard old estimates entirely. No incremental revisions, no adjustment factors, no assumptions carried forward. They were to start from zero and build new estimates based solely on comprehensive evidence. For 6 weeks, the officers worked in isolation. They examined every data point systematically. They cross-checked ship sightings against radio intercepts. They matched prisoner testimony to training facility capacity. They correlated convoy traffic with escort requirements. They reconciled observed fleet deployments with logistical support structures. Every contradiction was re-examined. Every assumption was challenged. On November 9, 1943, the report was completed. Its conclusions were devastating. The working group estimated American naval personnel strength at approximately 1.8 million by mid-1943, with projected growth to 2.4 million by mid-1944, based on observed expansion rates. Even these numbers were conservative. The analysts deliberately hedged. They resisted presenting figures that appeared extreme, even when evidence suggested higher totals, out of concern that numbers too far outside accepted norms would be rejected outright. Still, the estimate was close enough to reality that its implications could no longer be denied. An extensive appendix accompanied the report. It analyzed what these revised manpower figures meant for Japanese strategy. The conclusions invalidated every foundational assumption of the war. If the United States Navy had nearly 2 million sailors already in service, it could operate multiple major fleet concentrations simultaneously without stripping forces from other theaters. The Pacific and Atlantic were no longer competing priorities. They were independent. America could conduct unrestricted offensive operations in the Pacific while maintaining full-strength convoy escort operations in the Atlantic. Losses in one theater did not weaken the other. There was no trade-off. They could absorb combat losses at rates Japan could never replace and still grow overall force strength. They could maintain vast logistics networks stretching across thousands of miles of open ocean. They could garrison island bases permanently instead of rotating limited forces. They could fight continuously, everywhere. The defensive perimeter strategy was obsolete. The assumption that American forces were too limited to attack multiple points simultaneously was false. The belief that America would tire of a long war and negotiate was fantasy. The Americans were not approaching a breaking point. They were accelerating. They were going to keep building ships, keep training crews, keep sending them west, until Japan collapsed under the sheer weight of numbers. The working group's conclusion was blunt and unambiguous. Japan had entered a war against an opponent whose mobilization potential was an order of magnitude greater than intelligence estimates had predicted. This was not a problem that could be solved with better tactics. Superior training could not fix it. Superior fighting spirit could not overcome it. Superior seamanship
could not negate it. A 10-to-1 manpower disadvantage could not be reversed. The mathematics were absolute. Japan could not win a war of attrition against the United States. The only remaining question was how long Japan could continue fighting and whether any negotiated settlement could be reached before total collapse. The report went to the highest levels of naval leadership. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, serving as Navy Minister, received a copy. Senior officers on the Naval General Staff studied it closely. No one disputed the analysis. The evidence was overwhelming. But they also understood what the report meant. If field commanders learned that the war was mathematically unwinnable, morale would collapse. Combat effectiveness depends not only on weapons, but on belief. If the government acknowledged that the war had been launched based on intelligence estimates wrong by nearly 8-to-1, accountability would follow. Careers would end. Leadership would fracture. In the middle of a losing war, institutional crisis could be fatal. And if the emperor understood the scale of the error, the entire military leadership could be held responsible for a strategic disaster without precedent. The political consequences were unacceptable. The report was classified at the highest security level. Distribution was limited to fewer than 20 officers. It was contained, controlled, buried. Official internal planning documents were quietly adjusted. Resource allocation models changed subtly. But there was no public acknowledgement, no strategic reset, no explanation why the numbers had changed. The war continued as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Field commanders were not informed. They continued planning operations based on the belief that American forces were overextended. That belief was wrong. It had always been wrong. And now the people at the top knew it was wrong. But the machine of war was already moving, and stopping it would require admitting catastrophic failure. By December 1943, actual American naval strength reached 2,374,094 personnel. Japanese estimates before the war had predicted 296,000. The error was 7.8-to-1. This was not a failure of intelligence collection. The information had been there all along. Prisoner interrogations, radio intercepts, ship sightings, technical publications, training facility data. The failure was analytical. Japanese intelligence officers could not conceive of an enemy that mobilized the way America did. They interpreted every data point through a Japanese lens. They assumed American navies worked like Japanese navies. They assumed training took years, that manpower had limits, that expansion was gradual. Those assumptions were fatal. The consequences unfolded with brutal inevitability. In 1944, the United States launched simultaneous major offensives across the globe. The Central Pacific Drive surged through the Marshalls and Marianas towards the Philippines. The Southwest Pacific advanced along New Guinea. Operations continued in China, Burma, India. And still, full-strength forces remained in the Atlantic. Japanese commanders watched American task forces regenerate regardless of losses. Sink one carrier group, 2 more appeared. Destroy a dozen escorts, 20 replaced them. Losses that would have shattered Japan barely slowed America. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, Japan committed its remaining carrier strength in a final gamble. The Americans responded with a task force of 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers. The personnel operating that single task force numbered approximately 70,000. Japan was not fighting a fleet, it was fighting a system. And by the time Japanese intelligence finally understood that system, it was already unstoppable.
The Imperial Japanese Navy at the start of the war, December 1941, numbered fewer than 400,000 personnel. That included every branch, every shore establishment, every training command, and all administrative functions. By comparison, American task forces were now being fielded with manning levels that represented significant portions of Japan's entire naval strength. And the Americans were running multiple task forces of similar size simultaneously, operating in different theaters at the same time. The scale of American mobilization had become visible, undeniable, and impossible to explain away. The Battle of the Philippine Sea laid this reality bare. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 3 carriers sunk, approximately 450 aircraft lost, along with their pilots and air crews. By any measure, these were staggering losses. Yet the Americans lost only 29 aircraft. Their carriers resumed full operations within hours, fully restored, fully capable. The battle demonstrated in brutal clarity what unlimited personnel availability meant in practical terms. The Americans could absorb losses that would cripple other navies. They could maintain operations without pause. They could press attacks continuously, drawing from reserves that Japan could not match. Training pipelines churned out thousands of new sailors every month, sustaining both expansion and replacement of combat attrition. Shore establishments were vast enough to support operations indefinitely, without degradation. Japan had none of these advantages. Every loss was permanent. Every pilot killed represented years of training lost forever. Every ship sunk reduced capability that could never be recovered, constrained by Japan's limited industrial and personnel base. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with the greater resources. And in this case, the Americans had resources Japan could not match, regardless of fighting spirit or tactical skill. For Japanese officers who understood the true situation, the most painful realization was this: the war had been lost before it began, not because of tactical mistakes that could have been corrected, not because of strategic errors that might have been avoided, but because of an intelligence failure so fundamental that it made victory mathematically impossible, regardless of how Japan fought. If Japanese planners in 1941 had known that by 1944 America would deploy over 2 million sailors in the Pacific Theater alone, the strategic calculus would have been entirely different. The argument that America lacked the will to fight a prolonged war becomes meaningless when that same America had the capacity to fight 3 major wars simultaneously in different hemispheres without straining its mobilization capacity. The hope that Japan could seize territory and hold it collapsed the moment it became clear that the enemy could generate replacement forces faster than Japan could inflict losses. The entire premise of Japanese strategy rested on false assumptions: that early victories could secure a defensive perimeter, that America would eventually accept a negotiated settlement rather than commit to a costly war of attrition. Those assumptions were wrong from the beginning.
Some historians argue that even with accurate intelligence, Japan might have gone to war anyway. The oil embargo imposed by the United States left Japan facing economic strangulation. Resource needs, particularly oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Southeast Asia, demanded military action. Japan's military culture prioritized honor and national prestige over pragmatic calculations of probable success. These arguments are valid, but they miss a critical point. Wars are fought by people who believe they can win, or at least believe victory is possible if they fight hard enough. Accurate intelligence about American strength would not have prevented the war, but it would have fundamentally changed how Japan fought. Realistic estimates of a 10-to-1 manpower disadvantage might have shifted strategy toward limited objectives rather than sprawling territorial conquest. Defensive strategies might have received priority over aggressive operations aimed at decisive victory. Negotiation attempts might have been pursued seriously before the strategic situation became completely hopeless. The war that actually occurred, with its relentless offensive campaigns and categorical rejection of compromise, was only possible because Japan believed it was facing a constrained opponent. That belief was wrong from the beginning, and the intelligence failure that created it cost Japan everything it sought to defend. Commander Chikataka Nakajima served with the Second Fleet and Combined Fleet from December 1941 until August 1945. His duties included assembling intelligence from multiple sources, preparing estimates of enemy capabilities and intentions, analyzing naval operations to extract lessons for future planning. After the war, Nakajima was interviewed extensively by American naval intelligence officers who sought to understand how Japan had assessed American strength throughout the conflict. When asked directly about the catastrophic errors in estimating American manpower, Nakajima was candid. Japanese naval intelligence had been chronically understaffed. It was organizationally weak, marginalized in the Navy hierarchy. Intelligence billets carried lower prestige and fewer promotion opportunities than combat or command positions. Officers raising concerns about American capabilities were often ignored or dismissed. The system was designed to support decisions that had already been made, not challenge them. Accurate assessment requires the ability to accept uncomfortable truths. The Japanese system was not built to accept them, and as a result, catastrophic miscalculation became nearly inevitable. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, Navy Minister from October 18, 1941 to July 17, 1944, and briefly Chief of the Naval General Staff in 1944, presided over the Navy during the entire first phase of the Pacific War. After Japan's surrender, Shimada was arrested and tried as a Class A war criminal. The failures exposed in the naval intelligence system, failures of analysis, cultural assumptions, and institutional inertia, reverberated across every battle in the Pacific, sealing Japan's fate long before its final surrender.
Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, Navy Minister during the first phase of the Pacific War, faced charges after Japan's surrender. Waging aggressive war, violating international law, crimes against peace. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. Shimada served 11 years in Sugamo prison, paroled in 1955 due to declining health, and died in 1976 at age 92. one of the last surviving senior admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Throughout his remaining years, Shimada never publicly acknowledged the intelligence reports that had warned of American manpower superiority years before the war ended. In his testimony and later statements, he maintained that Japan had fought with honor and determination against overwhelming odds that could not have been foreseen. In one sense, this was true. Japan did fight with honor and determination, but it was also fundamentally incomplete. Japan fought with honor against odds that its own intelligence services had catastrophically underestimated before the war, and senior leadership, including Shimada, had failed to adapt once the truth became clear. The institutional failure extended beyond miscalculation. Japan failed to adjust strategy when reality contradicted assumptions. Intelligence warnings were suppressed, ignored, or discounted. The operational machinery continued to run on false premises, even as the truth became evident. The final accounting was simple, brutal, and mathematically absolute. Japan began the war with 120,000 naval personnel, officers, sailors, and support staff. By 1945, that number had grown to 300,000, a threefold increase over 4 years. By any historical standard, this was impressive. By the standard that mattered in the Pacific War, it was insufficient. The United States began the war in December 1941 with 337,000 naval personnel. By August 1945, the Americans had grown that force to over 3,380,000, a tenfold increase in less than 4 years. In 1944 alone, the Americans trained and deployed more sailors than Japan had in its entire navy at peak strength. They operated more ships than Japan could build. They flew more aircraft than Japan could manufacture. They moved more supplies across greater distances than Japan could imagine. They sustained forces simultaneously in multiple theaters, far beyond Japanese expectations. The intelligence estimate that projected 296,000 American sailors by December 1943 missed the actual number, 2,034,343, by a factor of nearly 8 to 1. This was not a minor miscalculation. It was not the result of incomplete data or enemy deception. It was a fundamental failure to understand the nature of the enemy Japan faced. That failure decided the outcome of the war before Pearl Harbor, before the first American ship was sunk, before the first battle was fought. No matter how brilliant Japanese tactics were, or how disciplined its sailors, the numbers alone made victory impossible. Intelligence working groups in late 1943 produced comprehensive reassessments showing that American strength far exceeded anything Japanese planners had assumed. The numbers were clear. The implications were unmistakable. The war was mathematically lost. But the system could not act on uncomfortable truths. Reports were classified at the highest security levels. Distribution was restricted to a tiny group with operational need to know. Field commanders continued planning based on outdated assumptions. Acting on the truth would have meant admitting catastrophic institutional failure. The machine of war could not stop. Sometimes intelligence is about collecting information. Sometimes it is about analyzing that information. But sometimes it is about seeing an uncomfortable truth nobody wants to hear. The tragedy of Japanese naval intelligence in World War II was not that they eventually discovered the truth. It was that the system prevented that truth from changing the course of the war. The evidence was available, the truth was discovered, and then it was buried, because acting on it would have required acknowledging failures that the institution could not admit. Japan had prepared to fight a mirrored enemy, one that mobilized slowly, carefully, and with emphasis on quality over quantity. What Japan faced was an enemy operating on a completely different scale. Unlimited manpower reserves, the organizational capacity to train civilians into sailors in months, not years, the ability to sustain losses and still expand, the capacity to fight multiple major wars simultaneously. The enemy destroyed Japan, not because of superior ships or tactics, though often those were true, but because there were simply so many more Americans. 296,000 estimated, 2,034,343 actual. That gap tells the complete story. One catastrophic intelligence failure determined the Pacific War before it began. The numbers were always there, in technical publications, census data, and industrial statistics. What was missing was the ability to see beyond cultural assumptions, to understand an enemy operating on a completely different rules. That blindness, that inability to grasp reality, cost Japan everything it fought to preserve. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.